Once again today, our scripture comes to us in two pieces. And the first piece of that scriptural text begins with a report that comes to Jesus about some Galileans who died rather tragically. The author paints a rather gruesome picture of that tragic death. And I think we probably need not to take it quite as literally as it comes, but to understand it in a broader context. In fact, this is one of those rare instances where the event is actually documented in material outside of the Bible. And the story is that there were some men who came to Jerusalem from Galilee to offer their sacrifices at the temple. And as they ascended the steps to the temple, they were confronted by Roman soldiers who had identified them as insurrectionists who attacked them and in fact killed them on the steps leading up to the temple. The other story is not verified. While there was indeed a Tower of Siloam, there's no historical record of it ever having fallen and killed anybody, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. The point is, in each of those stories, there was a very tragic death. And Jesus used those two incidents to really attack what was a commonly held belief in his time. And that belief was that tragic deaths are an indication of God's punishment on the lives of individuals. Or in other words, people who are really bad sinners, God judges and brings to a very tragic end. And the teaching that Jesus offers in the midst of that is, no. Their death had nothing to do with whether they were sinners or not sinners or whether their sin was worse than anybody else's sin. It was simply a tragic death. But then Jesus uses that to point out that everyone confronts death sooner or later. And that we never know for sure when that death will come, and therefore we must all live our lives repentantly. That is, we must all live our lives calling for and falling upon the forgiveness of God that brings us mercy. So the teaching is basically that God is not one who destroys us out of judgment. Then Jesus told a parable, and it may look at first glance that the parable doesn't really quite fit, but I'll let you be the judge of that. The parable is about a landowner who goes out into his vineyard. We probably ought to understand it as garden. That would make more sense to us. And in the vineyard was a fig tree. A fig tree that for 3 years had not produced any figs. And we assume that the landowner was in fact a for-profit landowner, and this barren fig tree was cutting into his economy. And therefore, seeing the barrenness of the tree, he says, cut it down. It's wasting the soil. It would be better to plant in its place something that's going to bear fruit. Yet, the gardener says, whoa, hold it. Wait a minute. Not so fast. First, let me cultivate around it. Let me put fertilizer on it, and let's see what happens. And if it does indeed bear fruit, then all the better. And if it doesn't bear fruit, then next year you can cut it down. Now, clearly the intent of Jesus is to provide an alternative way of looking at God. Not the one who judges because of degrees of sin, but the one who seeks beyond the barrenness of our lives to bring forth what might be. Many of you know that I'm a Peanuts fan. I love Charles Schulz and the way he presents life. One of my favorite cartoons, Lucy and Charlie Brown are walking down the sidewalk together. And in typical fashion, Lucy is just railing on Charlie Brown. And she says, "Charlie Brown, sooner or later, you've got to figure out that you reap what you sow. You get out of life exactly what you put into it, no more and no less." Snoopy, overhearing this and off to the side, muses to himself, "Personally, I'd like a little more margin for error." You see, the parable is about that margin for error. A God who looks at us and sees not what is, but what might be, and loves us into becoming that what might be, in contrast to the God who simply strikes us down when we have sinned. Folks, I don't know about you, but I can love that kind of God. I can love a God who doesn't punish me for the wrong, but lifts me up so that I can do right. Who doesn't strike me down because I haven't done, but puts a little fertilizer around my roots so that I can do better. That's a pretty good God. But as we go through this Lenten season, we must also look into this scripture to hear a message for us in our own walk of faith as we journey to Jerusalem with Jesus. And I invite you to do that. When I was in commerce at the University Christian Center, I did a whole series of summer camps for the Paris Sulphur Springs district. We did them up at what was then Texoma Methodist Camp, now Prothero Center. And I really kind of enjoyed it, though I look back on it wondering why. One year I was doing a senior high camp. And I was in charge. It was my camp. And on Monday morning, as we were getting ready for all the kids to arrive, we were going through the list of those that had registered, kind of trying to identify them and figure out who they were and where they were from and all of that. And as we were going through the list, one of my counselors went, "Oh my, Bill's coming." Well, yeah, that gets your attention, folks. Trust me, it does. I said, "Okay, what's the oh my?" And he said, "This kid is going to ruin everything." He said he comes every single year and we have to send him home because he just disrupts the whole camp. Then they said, "Now, if you know what's good for you, you're going to sit on him when he walks through the door and you're not going to get up because he's going to run the show if you let him." Well, I was forewarned. Bill showed up at our staff meeting that night at 9 o'clock. The first item on the agenda is, what are we going to do with Bill? Because in the few short hours that he had been there, he had totally disrupted our opening worship service. He had caused so much chaos in our programming that we had to drop some events and reschedule because we spent so much time dealing with his antics and the things he was doing that brought disruption to us. And, of course, the word from my counselors was, "We told you so." And they were unanimous in their decision that to save the camp, we needed to send him home. Well, I was the director. I had the final say. And I just didn't want to do that. That's not my style. And so we kind of talked through it. And I said, instead of sending him home, let's see if we can't love him into being better. They didn't like that, but they did it anyway. I'm here to tell you, folks, that Saturday didn't come soon enough. And when Saturday came, I had a big smile on my face as I waved goodbye to Bill, praying that I would never see him again as long as I lived. God did not answer that prayer. For 2 weeks later, we're at the mall, family, and from behind I hear, "Hey, preach!" I knew who it was because I had heard that same greeting 5 or 6 times a day for 5 days. I knew that Bill had found me. Now, what I wanted to do was keep walking and pretend that I never heard him. But I couldn't do that. So I tried putting a smile on my face and a little bit of warmth in my heart and turned around to greet him. Bill came up to me in his typical clownish style and was cutting up and doing all of the things that Bill had been doing for that whole week of camp. And then suddenly Bill changed. And he got really serious for a moment and he said, "Preach," he said, "you know, I know that I really made it rough on you at camp." He said, "that probably wasn't a good thing for me to do." He said, "but I want you to know something." He said, "this is the first time I've ever gone to camp and stayed the whole week." He said, "I had one of the best times of my life." He said, I can't make promises that I can't keep. But if you'll let me come back next year, I'll really try to do better." Well, I saw Bill a few more times after that. I didn't do camp next year, so I don't know if he went back or not. But somehow, I know that by putting a little love around the roots of his being, Bill's life was touched. And whether it was a life-altering change or a momentary change for a moment, for just a moment, Bill came to understand that he was a loved person. And I think we did the right thing. You see, as we journey to Jerusalem, we come to realize that some of the thorns that come into our lives are of our own making. That some of those thorns come from a judgment of others that is too hasty. Because we see them as they are. Yet God sees them as they might become. And if we are to truly be disciples, that means that we must somehow become like God. And learn not to see what is, but what might be.